In 1899, thousands of ordinary Americans mailed their hard-earned savings to a cramped little office in Brooklyn, New York. They were promised something no bank would ever offer: 10% profit every single week, guaranteed more than 500% a year. Within months, more than $1 million had poured into that office money that would be worth tens of millions today. And then, almost overnight, the doors slammed shut. The money was gone, and the man behind it disappeared across the border. His name was William, 520%, Miller, a 25-year-old church worker who turned himself into one of America's first great financial swindlers. How did he convince careful, church-going families that such impossible returns were safe? Why did the authorities move so slowly that most of the money could never be recovered? This is the forgotten true story of the Franklin Syndicate, the 1,890 seconds Ponzi scheme before Ponzi. Picture New York at the end of the 19th century. Brooklyn has just been folded into Greater New York City. The Brooklyn Bridge is still new, and streetcars and horse-drawn wagons crowd the streets. Across the river, Wall Street looms large in the imagination. Most Americans have never seen a stock exchange, but they read about sudden fortunes and sudden crashes in the papers. There are no federal securities laws yet, no securities regulator, no investor protection hotlines, no online tools to check a broker's license. If you want to invest, you rely on your local banker, your church friends, or the man whose advertisement looks most convincing. Newspapers are the main media of the day. On one page, a columnist might warn you about get-rich-quick schemes. On the very next page, in large, bold type, an investment syndicate promises sure profits and inside information if you mail them your cash. For working and middle-class families, the church is a trusted anchor. If a young man is active in a Christian society, teaches Sunday school, and speaks politely about helping small investors, many people feel safe handing him their savings. In that world where Wall Street looked magical, regulation was thin, and community trust meant everything a man like William F. Miller could do very, very well. William F. Miller was not a famous banker. He was a 25-year-old from Brooklyn involved in his church's Christian Endeavor group, known as a serious, religious young man with a growing interest in the stock market. Before the Franklin Syndicate, he tried his hand at speculation in a small way and lost money. He had no formal Wall Street training, no major firm behind him, and no proven track record, just a belief that the market could make him rich. In early 1899, he approached 3 friends from his church. He told them he could invest their money using special stock tips and promised something they had never heard from any bank: 10% profit every week, with the principal guaranteed against loss. One of them gave him just $10 to start. Miller handed back a printed receipt that looked official and reassuring, clear proof, on paper, that their money was safe and that it would earn steady weekly interest. Then he added an incentive that would supercharge his scheme. He promised his early backers a 5% commission on any money they brought in from friends and family. Overnight, his investors became his sales force. As the months passed, other figures stepped into the story. Edward Schlesinger, one of Miller's associates, demanded a third of the daily intake in cash, which forced the syndicate to count out huge sums every evening. And a New York attorney, Colonel Robert A. Ammon, began advising Miller on how to protect himself legally and financially. On the other side were the victims, though they did not see themselves that way yet. A shop owner in Brooklyn, a railroad worker from another state, a widow with a small nest egg, ordinary Americans sending $10, $50, or $100, hoping to turn it into something more. For a while, everything seemed to work. Checks arrived on time. People saw 10% each week, just as promised, and told their neighbors that Brother Miller was a blessing. But behind the friendly smile and the church reputation, the numbers no longer made sense, and the money coming in was about to drown William F. Miller. What started as a tiny arrangement inside one church quickly spilled out into the streets of Brooklyn. Those first 3 investors told their brothers, cousins, co-workers, and anyone else trying to save a little extra. Miller rented a small office and gave it a respectable name: the Franklin Syndicate. The office had wooden desks, a sturdy safe, and soon a growing staff to open mail, count money, and issue receipts. On paper, he claimed to be using inside information to buy and sell stocks at just the right moment. In reality, there was no legal way to guarantee 10% every week. Even a very skilled trader could not promise that kind of return without taking enormous risks or without faking the results. Still, money kept arriving, and Miller decided to push his luck. He poured what would now be hundreds of thousands of dollars into newspaper advertising, claiming that the Franklin Syndicate was one of the largest operators on Wall Street. Those ads ran in hundreds of papers around the United States, reaching people who had never met Miller but felt they knew him from the bold claims on the page. Soon, the office was overwhelmed. Clerks worked at long tables, opening envelopes stuffed with bills, bank drafts, and money orders from as far away as the Midwest and the South. Some days, they took in tens of thousands of dollars. Inside the office, there was more cash than the safe could hold. Outside, lines of investors snaked down the street, some coming to pick up their weekly interest, others eager to hand over fresh money. Not everyone was impressed. A few skeptical editors pointed out the obvious: 520% a year was nonsense. They warned readers that no honest business could make such a promise. But their warnings had to compete with Miller's big paid ads and with the stories of neighbors who were, for the moment, getting paid right on time. By the fall of 1899, the Franklin Syndicate was taking in as much as $20,000 to $60,000 a day. At that pace, it was only a matter of time before the numbers and the law caught up with William Miller. Underneath the church talk and the fancy name, the Franklin Syndicate used a simple engine. New money came in from fresh investors. A portion of that money went right back out as interest to earlier investors. There was no real secret system producing those weekly 10% checks. The only system was this: keep the cash flowing, keep the receipts coming, and keep the believers happy long enough for more people to join. At its height, the Franklin Syndicate may have had 12,000 depositors and taken in around $1.16 million. In today's money, that would be the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars entrusted to a 25-year-old with no license and no oversight. Inside the office, clerks worked long hours, writing receipts and sealing envelopes. Outside, investors boasted that they had finally found a way to beat the banks and the big Wall Street houses. Miller's personal style remained surprisingly modest. He did not build a mansion or openly flaunt great riches, but he kept large amounts of cash in easy reach and did little to set aside money for the future, behaving more like a man caught up in the moment than a careful planner. While Miller's followers lined up for their weekly interest, another line formed in government offices. Postal inspectors and local prosecutors began collecting clippings and complaints. One postal inspector, William S. McGinnis, quietly opened an inquiry. He knew that using the mail for fraudulent schemes could be prosecuted under federal law, but he needed proof that people were being lied to and harmed. McGinnis mailed out around 250 letters to investors, asking if they had any complaints about the Franklin Syndicate. Most wrote back to say they were delighted. As long as the weekly payments kept coming, they did not see themselves as victims at all. At the same time, financial writers dug into Miller's Wall Street claims. They searched for real brokerage accounts in his name and came up empty. Some banks had already closed his accounts because the patterns of deposits and withdrawals looked suspicious. These findings made their way into print. By late November 1899, the Franklin Syndicate was no longer just a curiosity. It was a front-page scandal. As the criticism grew louder, Colonel Ammon proposed a new strategy. He suggested that Miller formally incorporate the Franklin Syndicate and offer investors shares of stock in exchange for their deposit receipts. To the public, this looked like a promotion from depositor to shareholder. To Ammon, it was a way to gather up and destroy receipts that promised guaranteed returns and repayment documents that could be very dangerous in court. Miller began mailing out stock certificates, even though the corporation paperwork was incomplete and misleading. Newspaper investigations pointed out these irregularities and warned that something was deeply wrong. On November 22, 1899, a detailed exposé laid bare the truth. False promises, phony corporate claims, and almost no real investing behind the scenes. The next day, frightened investors rushed to withdraw their money. While they crowded the office, Miller carried a sack of cash, roughly $250,000 in cash and assets, to Ammon's office. The attorney assured him that money held by a lawyer was protected and that the law could not touch it as easily. Then, as tempers rose outside the Franklin Syndicate, William 520% Miller vanished. He left his wife and child behind in Brooklyn and slipped north toward Canada. The man who claimed he could beat Wall Street every week was now running from the law. Once the doors closed and the money stopped flowing, the tone of investor letters changed overnight. People who had written glowing testimonials now sent angry complaints, describing lost savings and broken promises. Brooklyn prosecutors and postal inspectors finally had what they needed. They gathered receipts that guaranteed impossible returns, copies of the bold advertisements, and witness statements from former workers describing piles of cash and frantic bookkeeping. When investigators totaled up the known deposits, they estimated that the Franklin Syndicate had taken in around $1.16 million. Only a little more than $10,000 was recovered in cash or assets that could be sold. Some money was found hidden in the home of Miller's brother, stuffed into a sofa. The brother claimed it was intended for payroll, and prosecutors decided he was a minor player. The main focus stayed on Miller and Ammon. Canadian authorities located Miller in Montreal. He was arrested and brought back to New York to face charges. The young church worker who once handed out neat little receipts was now led through Brooklyn streets in the custody of police. Newspapers across the country reported that 520% Miller had been caught. In the spring of 1900, Miller went on trial in Kings County. The courtroom was packed with victims, reporters, and curious citizens who had followed the story in the press. Prosecutors charged him with grand larceny. They argued that from the very beginning, he had promised something he knew, or should have known, was impossible, and that he had used new investors' money to pay off earlier ones. They produced receipts guaranteeing that principal was absolutely safe and that 10% per week was assured. They showed ads and circulars boasting of secret stock tips and huge sure profits without explaining any real investment plan. Former employees described the crush of mail and the mountains of cash. Investors testified that everything seemed fine until the payments suddenly stopped and the office closed. The defense tried to tell a different story. They said Miller had been overly optimistic, that he hoped to beat the market and make everyone whole, and that more worldly men like Ammon had taken advantage of him. But the paper trail was hard to ignore. There was no legitimate business that could sustain 10% a week payouts. The only way the system worked was by constantly bringing in fresh money, just like the Ponzi schemes that would follow in later decades. In April 1900, the jury found Miller guilty. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in Sing Sing prison, the maximum penalty available under the law. Miller appealed. But in 1902, New York's highest court upheld the conviction. The judges ruled that he must go to jail, closing the legal chapter of the Franklin Syndicate case. Later, as his health declined, Miller began to talk more openly about what had happened. His statements helped authorities prosecute Colonel Ammon, who was eventually convicted of stealing tens of thousands of dollars and served his own prison term. The story ended with both the young promoter and his seasoned lawyer disgraced, but for the thousands of victims, the money was gone for good. Today, most people have heard of Charles Ponzi and of more recent cases like modern investment frauds. Few remember William 520% Miller, whose Franklin Syndicate ran the same basic playbook a generation earlier. He promised guaranteed returns that no honest business could deliver. He used new money to pay old obligations. He leaned on trust, especially religious trust, and the power of printed ads to keep the money flowing as long as possible. Cases like the Franklin Syndicate helped build the argument for stronger mail fraud enforcement, and later on for national securities laws. They showed lawmakers what can happen when there is plenty of promise and almost no oversight. Even now, regulators and consumer advocates warn about the same red flags: guaranteed above-market returns, pressure to reinvest instead of cashing out, appeals to shared beliefs or community ties to lower your guard. For viewers who lived through savings and loan failures, junk bond booms, tech bubbles, and modern Ponzi schemes, this story may feel very familiar. The names change, the technology changes, but the pitch often sounds the same. In 1899, people were told they could safely earn 10% every week. Today, the sales pitch might arrive by email, text message, or social media, promising unbelievable returns with no risk at all. The Franklin Syndicate reminds us that whenever someone offers you steady, sky-high profits with zero chance of loss, you are not being let in on a secret. You are being invited into the first chapter of a very old story, one that rarely ends well for the people who believe it. More than a century ago, thousands of Americans trusted a young man from Brooklyn with their savings. They believed his promise of 520% a year, guaranteed, and paid a terrible price. Do you see William 520% Miller as a clever swindler who knew exactly what he was doing, or as a reckless, naive promoter swept along by a system that rewarded big promises and punished caution? And with all the schemes we have seen in our own lifetimes, do you think we have truly learned the lesson, or are we still vulnerable to the next too good to be true offer? If you'd like to hear more forgotten stories like this one about early Ponzi schemes, historic frauds, and the crimes that shaped modern finance, consider subscribing and sharing this video.